Imagine that a defender of the modern corporation has just listened to the last two lectures and has now been given the invitation to respond. What are they going to say? How might they defend a hierarchy of authority in which employers go beyond what is necessary for producing greater economic efficiency and exert arbitrary and unaccountable power over their workers? One thing they might say is, well, if you don't like it, leave. And on pages 54 to 55 of Private Government, Anderson quotes two people, Armin Alkian and Harold Dumsetz, who make an argument basically that's like that. Here's what they write. It is common to see the firm characterized by the power to settle issues by fiat, by authority, or by disciplinary action. This is a delusion. The firm has no power of fiat, no authority, no disciplinary action any different in the slightest degree from ordinary market contracting between any two people. I can punish you only by withdrawing future business or by seeking redress in the courts for any failure to honor our exchange agreement. That is exactly all that any employer can do. He can fire or sue just as I can fire my grocer by stopping purchases from him or sue him for delivering faulty products. What then is the content of the presumed power to manage and assign workers to various tasks? Exactly the same as one little consumer's power to manage and assign his grocer to various tasks. To speak of managing, directing, or assigning workers to various tasks is a deceptive way of noting that the employer continually is involved in renegotiation of contracts on terms that must be acceptable to both parties. Telling an employee to type this letter rather than to file that document is like telling a grocer to sell me this brand of tuna rather than that brand of bread. I have no contract to continue to purchase from the grocer, and neither the employer nor the employee is bound by any contractual obligations to continue their relationship. So, what exactly do they mean by this? So Anderson considers and rejects a couple of different interpretations. One interpretation is that authority doesn't exist within a relationship if both parties have the power to leave. But that statement is just false. It's possible for Italians to emigrate. That didn't mean that Mussolini didn't have dictatorial authority within Italy, right? So the ability to leave doesn't mean that people in the relationship aren't in relationships of power and authority to one another. Another interpretation is that authority doesn't exist if the only possible sanctions are exile or a civil suit. But that can't be right either. Surely the threat of losing a job is a serious enough sanction that to be subject to that threat is to be under a manager's authority. And what's more, managers do have other sanctions at their disposal. They can cut workers' hours, they can humiliate them, they can even assign them to dangerous tasks. So that can't be right either. One final interpretation is that maybe consensual relationships can involve relations of subordination to authority. But that doesn't make sense either. We can consent to be governed, right? And when we're governed, we're under the authority of others. And there's a whole tradition in political philosophy that says that that's how government works. That's how liberal democracies work. There's according to social contract theory, the governed consent to be governed. So one thing that underlies all these different interpretations is the idea that exiting a firm is sufficient, or the ability to exit a firm is sufficient to protect the basic liberties and interests of workers. And so I want to address that. Now, Anderson's position is that exit is really important, but it is insufficient for the task. So imagine that you're working as a waitress, and it's likely that you're going to experience some sort of degrading treatment from customers or even sexual harassment. If all of your training and job experience make you competitive for the waitress industry and not any other ones, exit to another restaurant is basically your only form of exit that's feasible to you. And if all the other restaurants have the same problems, then exit isn't going to be something that actually addresses the problem, which is degrading treatment and sexual harassment. So exit doesn't work there. Now, what you might think is like, okay, if you're a waitress, you can get some sort of other job, but not everybody has this ability. So imagine that you're a worker in a slaughterhouse. So slaughterhouse workers are routinely denied bathroom breaks, they develop injuries from repetitive motions, they're exposed to dangerous pathogens on a daily basis, and they experience all sorts of other harms just as part of the job. And the people who take these jobs are often undocumented workers who have few other options. And they do have the right to leave, like they're not being enslaved against their will, but doing so is really infeasible for them. There's no place for them to exit to. There aren't other jobs available that they could take. So for this reason, exit is insufficient to protect their most basic and important interests. So Anderson has a really nice quote that sums this up on page 61 of Private Government. Consent to an option within a set cannot justify the option set itself. Yeah, you might hear my dog. She just had her teeth cleaned, and she's waking up from the anesthetic. So, she's just sort of getting over, she's a little bit drowsy from general anesthesia, and she gets a little bit upset sometimes. So if you hear that, that's what's going on. Let's keep going, though. So, consent to an option set cannot justify the option set itself. So what do we need? What's the solution? What other ways can we try to protect the basic interests and rights of workers? Well, so the first thing you got to note is that Anderson is not calling for a return to communism. She's not calling for the complete elimination of workplace hierarchies or fully democratic workplaces. So don't you dare accuse her of doing any of those things. She's not doing them. Instead, what she's doing is she's saying that we need to supplement exit with 3 other strategies for protecting the rights of workers. And that sound is my dog drinking water. So here's what they are. The 3 other strategies are the rule of law, substantive constitutional rights, and voice. Now, let's go through these in order. So laws protect the liberties of subjects in a couple of ways. So here's a couple of them. She goes over more in her book and in her lectures, but one of them is that they establish limits on the ways that subjects can be dominated by their governments. And they do this by establishing clear rules through reasonable processes that are promulgated. So they're widely shared so that you can read them, you can find out about them. They also help bring about uniform treatment by describing a set of rules that, in theory, apply equally to everyone. Now, we know that laws don't always get applied to everyone equally, but in theory, that would be a good benefit of laws. So laws are important for protecting workers. There's no doubt about that. For example, sexual harassment laws can be great. But the problem is they're not enough because it would be impossible to come up with a set of laws that were fine-grained enough to apply to all the possible scenarios that emerge in business contexts. In large firms, coordination of activities often requires close supervision by agile managers who can quickly issue novel orders to subordinates. And they come up with a set of laws that's going to govern all such relationships between managers and subordinates is either going to involve coming up with laws that are just way too restrictive, and then the managers aren't going to have the agility to be able to intervene in the ways that they should, or it's going to be so permissive that it's going to not really protect the basic interests of workers. So laws, because they need to be these general sorts of things, aren't fine-grained enough tools to get the job done, but they are an important start, and we should still have laws for, against things like sexual harassment. Constitutional rights are also important. So take a Bill of Rights. So a Bill of Rights that guarantees a right to a safe working environment sounds wonderful. Like we should have OSHA standards that protect workers from dangerous situations. Now, thing is though, constitutional rights offer inadequate protections for a similar reason as did laws. Since constitutional rights have to be general enough to apply to all workplaces, they're just not going to be specific enough to offer the fine-grained protections needed in each workplace. Different rights are needed by waiters, sailors, and assembly line workers. So at most, what constitutional rights are going to give us is a basic minimal set of standards of protections that aren't going to go all the way that we need them to go. So they're a good start, but they're not enough. So due to the inadequacies of law, exit, and constitutional rights, Anderson thinks that we need something else. So what she says, we need to have a voice. Workers need to have a voice in how they're governed. But what's that going to look like? Well, one option is a workplace democracy. And in a workplace democracy, you would have workers owning and collectively managing a firm. Now, the problem with workplace democracy is that it would face enormous practical difficulties. So the efficiency of the firm, for example, would suffer due to the high costs of the negotiations that would have to take place. But luckily, workplace democracy isn't the only option, and that's not what Anderson is calling for. She's not saying that we need to go all the way to workplace democracy. One other option is to have strong labor unions. So labor unions have allowed workers to organize collectively and advocate for better rules and compensation. Now, labor unions have costs also. So, for example, they can foster adversarial relationships between management and the workers. And these relationships can be like unhealthy or disturbing for both the managers and the workers in some cases. They can also create inefficiencies by holding monopoly power over labor. A final option is to give workers the ability to vote on important company decisions that affect them. So at the end of the day, there isn't going to be a one-size-fits-all solution for giving workers a voice because different workers and firms have different needs. So maybe a small co-op grocery store that is collectively owned could function as an actual workplace democracy. That sounds beautiful. In the case of a symphony orchestra, unions have been really important. They've fought hard for blind auditions to help reduce discrimination in hiring, for extremely strict rules about when rehearsals begin and end, the length of rehearsals, the temperature of the rehearsal space, and the minimum amount of time that can exist between successive performances. In a corporation where worker cooperatives are impossible due to the cost of equipment and use, one important way to allow workers to exercise their voice would be to have them vote on important company decisions. So this concludes my third of 3 lectures where I offer a presentation and explanation of Elizabeth Anderson's 2015 Tanner lectures. I would highly recommend checking out her whole thing if you want to get the full rich picture and nuance of her account. What I'm going to be doing next week is talking about some objections to Anderson's account and her responses to those objections. So stay tuned.